Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and this is a kind of a late broadcast tonight or sharing with you. I'm going to be reading from another book that I've been looking at by John Coleman. And John Coleman book is Dr. John Coleman, I should say. It's a One World Order Socialist Dictatorship. And we're going to be reading from it tonight. And I hope that this will help to enlighten you and see who the true enemy is. And we'll go from there. And again, the date of the day is today is Tuesday, the 10th day of January 2023. And my name is Brand Hunt, and my Discerning What is True is my channel on YouTube, shares on Facebook, and also on Odyssey. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope that some of these things will help you understand the situation that we really are in these days. Thank you. So we're looking at the One World Government, or he calls it, and this is by John Coleman, Socialist Dictatorships. The enemy in Washington is more to be feared than the enemy in Moscow. This is a sentiment I have expressed over and over again. Communism did not destroy tariff protections erected by President George Washington. Communism did not force the United States to adopt gradual income tax. Communism did not create the Federal Reserve Board. Communism did not get the United States in World War I or World War II. Communism did not force the United Nations on America. Communists did not take the Panama Canal away from the American people. Communists did not create the Global 2000 Report Mass Genocide Plan. It is socialism that has brought these evils upon the United States. Communism did not get the word world AIDS. Communism did not give American disaster levels of unemployment, as is happening now. Communism did not, Communists did not mount unrelenting attacks on the Constitution of the United States. Communism did not force America to adopt foreign aid that cursed tax on the American people, which is involuntary servitude. Communism did not force an end to school prayers. Communism did not promote the falsehood of separation of church and state. Communism did not give America the Supreme Court packed with justice, bound and determined to undermine the Constitution of the United States. Communism did not send out soldiers to fight a legal war in the Gulf to protect the interests of the British Crown. Yet for all these years, while our attention was focused on the evils of communism in Moscow, the socialists in Washington were busy stealing America, that is. One world order socialistic dictatorship tells how this was and is being accomplished. And what we're going to be dealing with is this first section here, how Fabian socialism began and subsequent history. So we're always pointing the finger to Russia, always, but the enemy's already at the door, folks. It's inside our own government. That's what he's saying. So here we go, as I share with you here. A quote here. We will build the New World Order piece by piece right under their noses. That is the American people. The house of the New World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. An end run around sovereignty, eroding its piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal attack. Richard Gardner, Leading American Socialists, Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, April 1974. In this, my third book, The Committee of 300 and the Diplomacy by Deception, I tell how Gardner's statement gives notice of the Fabian socialist agenda for the United States, the ideas, thoughts, and people who have worked diligently to establish socialism. The principal fatal political disease of modern nations is explained in clear detail. There is an account of the various socialist goals set by the British Fabian Society, whose motto is, make haste slowly. When asked to explain communism, Lenin replied, communism is socialism in a hurry. Socialism has nowhere to progress but to communism. Has no place but to communism. It's something I have often said. The book explains why so many of the ills that plague our society today have their origin in careful socialistic planning and execution. Socialism is inherently evil because it forces people to accept deliberately engineered changes that have neither requested nor want. The power of socialism is disguised in soothing terms and hides behind a mask of humanitarianism. Always has been, folks. Let's help the people. Let's help them, you see. But what they do is they take from others, you see, from the haves to the have-nots, you see. It's also found in far-reaching fundamental changes in religion, which the socialists have long used as a potent vehicle for gaining acceptance, at which they spread their influence inside churches to the detriment of all religions. The goal of socialism is the liquidation of the free enterprise system, which is true capitalism. Scientific socialism goes under several different disguises, and its promoters call themselves liberals or moderates. They wear no badges and are not recognizable as they would be if they called themselves communists. There are more than 300,000 socialists inside the United States government, and carefully estimate have it that in 1994, 87% of the members of Congress are socialists. That's how many years ago, folks? Almost 30 years ago. Executive orders are an unconstitutional socialist ruse to use the legislative route to make the Constitution of the United States of no effect. Where direct messages are not possible to bring about desired socialist change is blocked by the Constitution. Socialism is revolution without openly violent methods, but nevertheless does the utmost violence to the psyche of the nation. It is a movement governed by stealth. Its slow advance on the United States from its home base in England was almost imperceptible up to the 1950s. No one saw it. The Fabian socialist movement remains distinct from the so-called socialist party groups, and its forward crawl was thus almost impeccable to the majority, imperceptible of the people of America. When you wound a communist, a socialist bleeds. It is a saying that dates back to the early days of Fabian socialism. Socialism ardently welcomes proliferation of central government power, which they strive to secure for themselves, always pretending it to be for the common good. The United States and Britain are full to the brim with false prophets pushing the New World Order. These socialist missionaries preach peace and humanitarians and common good, fully aware that they could not overcome the resistance of the American people to communism by direct means. Insidious Fabian socialists knew they had to move silently and slowly and avoid alerting the people to their real objectives. Thus was scientific socialism adopted as the way to overcome the United States and making of it the leading socialist country in the world. How far Fabian socialists have succeeded and where we stand today is told in this book. President Wilson, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Carter, Kennedy, and Johnson were eager, willing servants of Fabian socialism. Their mantle was passed to President Clinton. Democracy and socialism go hand in hand. All United States presidents since Wilson have repeatedly stated that the United States is a democracy, when in fact it is a confederated republic. Fabian socialists direct the destiny of the world in a way which is disguised to render it unrecognizable. Socialism is the author of gradual income tax, the destroyer of nationalism, the author of the so-called free trade. See, they're not about protected trade, it's about free trade. This book is no dull account of the philosophical philosophies of socialism, but a dynamic, dramatic telling of how it became the foremost menace to free men everywhere, but more especially in the United States, which has still to confront it head on. The bland, smooth surface of socialism hides its true intent, a federal world government under socialist control, in which we, the people, will be their slaves in the new world order of the new dark ages. Chapter 1. How Fabian socialism began a subsequent history. Like all socialists, I believe that the socialist society evolves in time into a communist society. John Stradley, Labor Party of the Cabinet Ministry. In American newspaper jargon, John Stradley would be described as a Marxist #1, and the title would be deserved. Left News, March of 1938. Fabian socialism began with the Fabian Society, which in their words consists of socialists who outlined themselves with the Communist Manifesto of 1848, written by Karl Marx, a Prussian-born Jew who lived the better part of his life in Highgate, London. In the basis of the Fabian Society, we learn the following. It therefore aims at the reorganization of society by the emancipation of land and industrial capital from individual ownership, investing them into the community for the general benefit. In this way, only can natural and acquired advantages of the country be shared by the whole people. This was the principle that Fabian socialists exported to the United States, one which they had tirelessly forced upon the American people to the great detriment of the nation. Marx died in solitary digs, D-I-G-S, in October of 1883 without ever realizing the vision he shared with Moses Mendelssohn. That is, Mendelssohn is generally recognized as the father of European communism, and was buried in a small walled Highgate cemetery in North London. That the Communist Manifesto gave life to socialism was admitted by Professor Harold Laski, L-A-S-K-I, the man most closely identified with the movement from its inception and up to the time of his death in 1950. But socialism actually was born with the founding of the Ethical Society of Culture. If you understand that word culture, folks, that's a very key word. I've shared that in a couple of videos also, probably last 3 or 4 days. Culture is a way of tool to move people, you see. This is why people do certain things. This could be similar to what I would call the crowd. Formerly the Fellowship of New Life in New York, although the political economy of John Stuart Mill, as expressed in Henry George's socialist book, Progress and Poverty, the spiritual side of socialism should not be ignored. And yes, this book here is part of it. Okay? The Fabians, this is who these people are. They're the ones that really got involved. So you'll hear that Webb and his wife Beatrice ran the Fabian Society from its beginning. This is who the people are, okay? And people who really actually think that these people are great people when in reality they're not. They're snakes in the grass. Most of the members of the Fellowship of New Life, which preceded the Ethical Society of Culture, were Freemasons, affiliated with Madame Blavatsky occult theosophy, to which Annie Besant also subscribed. Annie Besant was also chairman of the Rosicrucians Society. Not that Lasky was in any sense a spiritual man, being more like Marx than Ramsay MacDonald, who went on to become Prime Minister of England. Lasky was a most powerful influence on scores of British political, economic, and church leaders, and is credited with having compelling influence on President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. Victor Gonzalez, the socialist publisher, said on many occasions that socialism is necessary for world domination. Socialism centralizes power and makes individuals completely subject to these who control that power, the publisher said. Having withdrawn from the Fellowship of New Life, Fabian socialists tried several paths already trodden by communists. Bakuski, I spell this for you, B-A-B-U-O-B, Balavistas, that is anarchists, and Karl Marx, always vehemently denying any connection with these movements. Consisting mainly of intellectuals, civil servants, journalists, and publishers like the great Victoria Gonzalez, Fabian socialists had no interest in getting involved with street fighting and anarchic revolutionaries. The founding members of Fabian Society or Socialism perfected their technique first used by Adam Weishaupt. That is penetrating the Catholic Church and then boring away from inside until just the empty husk was left. It was called penetration and permeation. Apparently, neither Weishaupt nor Gonzalez thought Christians would be smart enough to see what was happening. Gonzalez was reported as saying Christians are not exactly bright, so it will be easy for socialism to lead them down the garden path through their ideas of brotherly love and social justice. Fabian socialists target political, economic, and educational organizations. In addition to the Christian church, later Gonzalez left-wing books gave special discounts to Christians who were interested in socialism ideas. On the select committee of the Left Book Club was Gonzalez himself, Professor Harold Lasky, John Stratsky, and a Labor Party member of Parliament. Gonzalez, who also owned the Christian Book Club, was a strong believer in the Bolshevik Russia as an ally of socialism. As the urging of Beatrice Webb, he published one of the Fabian Society's bestsellers, Our Soviet Ally. Fabian socialists set out from the very beginning of the history to penetrate and permeate the British Labour and Liberal parties, as it turned out, also the Democratic Party of the United States. It was relentless in its zeal and energy to create feminist socialism, as which it was to become highly successful. Socialism succeeded in gaining the ascension of school boards, town councils, and labor unions under the guise of betting the lot of the working man. So it's always been about trying to help the little guy out, supposedly, you see. That's their main structure part, but that's not what's really going on here. Fabian socialist determination to capture education mirrors out what is Madame Zarovia as long counsel in Bolshevik Russia. That's Zinoviev. 1950, Gonzalez again published Corruption and Profit Economy, a widely read work by Mark Starr. Starr was the product of a Fabian socialist, and although considered a bit rough around the edges, he began life as a coal miner. He was not rejected by the Ivy League socialists of Harvard and Yale, to which the Fabian Society had gained access and orderly progressive up the ladder from its humble beginnings in London. Starr immigrated to the United States in 1928. After earning his socialist credentials at the National Council of Labor Colleges. Tutored by the formidable Margaret Cole, the founder of the Fabians Research Center, Starr was the link between the Fabian Society in London and the burgeoning socialist movement in America. Starr served at the Brookwood Labor College from 1925 to 1928, at an early age subject to a socialistic education second to none. The Socialist Garland Fund gave Starr a grant of $74,227, a considerable amount of money in those days. Yes, a considerable amount of money even today for many people. He later became educated director of the International Ladies Garments Worker Union from 1935 to 1962, and worked on his labor politics and labor education was outstanding in the cause of socialism. As far as Starr was concerned, education meant teaching that private property was wrong and should be abolished. But yet you have to understand these people, folks. That's where they got their money from. That's where all these people were. Okay. Maybe not the Starr guy, but definitely the Fabians for sure. In 1941, Starr was appointed vice president of the American Federation of Teachers, an avant-garde socialist teachers' body of the day. After taking American citizenship, Starr was named by President Harry Truman to the United States Advisory Commission, authorized by Public Act 402, to advise the State Department and the Congress on the operation of information centers and libraries maintained by the United States government in foreign countries, as well as the exchange of students and technical experts. This was indeed a coup for the socialists in the United States. Fabian socialists attracted many of the upper elite of society in Britain and the United States. It is said of American socialists that they aped their English better, admiring their command in the language, their quick turn of phrase, and their greater genteel respectability, perhaps versified by Professor Graham Wallace, Wallace, Sir Stanford Cripps, and Hartley Shawcross, and Richard Crossman. Professor Graham Wallace lectured at the New School for Social Research in New York City, a socialist think tank. Founded by the New Republic magazine. Wow. That catered for left-wing professors, of which the United States had more than its share. Wallace was one of the earliest, if not the earlier, intellectuals to join the then nondescript Fabian Society, which back in 1879 faced a very uncertain future and was not considered to be a threat to government or church. Wallace's early interest in education is mirrored by one of his earliest jobs, that of County School Management Committee of School Board. As we shall see in other chapters, the Fabian socialist hierarchy considered control of education their kingpin in their strategy to capture the world. Why wouldn't they? You can always teach children to believe certain things. When you begin to move that way, you can build an army, you see. That idea was further reflected by Wallace's teaching appointment at the London School of Economics, funded by Sidney Webb, and then still a fledgling socialistic institution of learning. Wallace had only 4 students in his class. Wallace believed that the way to socialize a country was through applied psychology. The way to socialize America, Wallace continued, was to take the mask of the population by the hand like children. He did not have a very high regard for the standards of education in the United States, that is, and like children, lead them one step at a time down the road to socialism, to which I would add an ultimate slavery. Wallace is an important name in this account of socialism, as he wrote a book which was adopted word for word by President Lyndon Johnson as the Democratic Party official policy. So this is in the 60s, folks. This is 66, 65, 64. After the killing of John F. Kennedy, this began to take place. The sinister creeping progress of socialism that began to blanket England might have been avoided but for World War I. The flower of Christian British youth who would have resisted the onward march of this alien concept lay dead in the fields of Flanders, their lives uselessly thrown away on a nebulous idea of patriotism. Numbed by the horrifying loss of their sons, the older generation did not care about what socialism was doing to their country, believing that there will always be an England. Social psychology was a weapon used definitely to deflect attacks on American favoritist organizations. Americans for Democratic Action is one of those groups, said that he was not part of the Fabian Society and its mouthpiece. The nation sought vehemently to deny attempts to tie the two in with each other. So in 1902, Wallace was teaching outright socialism at the Philadelphia University's summer sessions. He had been invited to the United States by wealthy American socialists who attended Oxford summer schools in 1899 and 1902. So this guy's a busy bee here, folks. He's not only in Britain, he's also here in the United States. So someone was giving him money, how to get across the ocean here, time-wise, everything, and being able to teach at a Philadelphia University summer session. The period when the summer school indoctrination classes were at the height of their popularity with rich Americans who had nothing better to do. The year 1910 found Wallace at the mentor of American socialist leaders like Walter Lippmann. Delivering the Lowell lectures at Harvard, Graham Wallace was recognized as being among the big 4 socialist intellectuals in Britain, and as such, he was sought out by the American socialist Ray Standard Baker, the emissary of Colonel Edward Mandell House. We've heard of his name, haven't we? Sent to the Paris Peace Conference to represent him and find out what the delegates were doing. Between 1905 and 1910, Graham Wallace wrote The Great Society, which was to become the blueprint for President Johnson's program of the same name and which embodies social psychology principles. Wallace made it very plain that the object of social psychology was to control human conduct, thus, thus preparing the masses for the coming socialist state that would ultimately lead them into slavery. Although he was careful not to spell it out that far, Wallace became a conduit into the United States for Fabian socialist ideas, much of them going into Roosevelt's New Deal, written by socialist Stuart Chase, Kennedy's New Frontier, written by socialist Henry Wallace, and Johnson's Great Society, written by Graham Wallace. From these facts alone, the tremendous impact of Fabian socialists upon the American political scene can be gauged. Like Professor Lasky, Wallace had the same good disposition and kindly nature which was to make such a big impact on political and religious leaders in the United States. Both men were to be the Fabian Society's most successful missionaries to universities and colleges all across the United States, not to mention their impact on the leaders of the aggressive feminist movement, which was just starting to happen. Thus, from the beginning, Fabian socialists in America, this dangerous radical movement was falsely clothed in the mantle of benignance that was able to deceive the very elect. That is, to paraphrase the Bible, it was a cover for revolution on both sides of the Atlantic, while remaining aloof from the violence generally associated with the word revolution. History one day will reveal that Fabian socialist revolution far exceeded in scope and breadth the violent Bolshevik Revolution. While the Bolshevik Revolution ended more than 50 years ago, the Fabian Socialist Revolution is still gathering momentum and growing even stronger. The unobstructed movement has literally moved mountains and vastly changed the course of history, and nowhere more so than in the United States. The two guiding lights who remain in control of Fabian society are socialists to the end of the days were George Bernard Shaw. That's right, folks. Those people who you think are really your friends are not your friends. Many people think that George Bernard Shaw is the greatest thing since sliced cake. You need to grow up. Sidney Webb, and then later they were joined by men like Graham Wallace, John Maynard Keynes, which is the one who's impacted our economy enormously in his foolishness of borrowing money, and Harry Lasky, whose dream of the socialist conquest of Great Britain and the United States they knew could only be could be realized by the progressive weakening of the financial system of each country. That's what John Maynard Keynes is all about, until they collapse into the total welfare state. And you're seeing that, folks. It's in your face here in the United States. It's in your face, even in the Trump administration, but even before then, the Obama administration. We see this now in every fact having overtaken Britain, which has become a bankrupt welfare state. Fabian socialism, second course of action, was against the constitutionality separation of power mandated by the United States Constitution. Professor Lasky and his colleagues felt that if the Fabian socialists could remove this obstacle, they could have or would have the key to dismantling the entire Constitution of the United States. Thus, it was imperative that socialism train and deploy special change agents who would be in position to undermine this most important provision in the Constitution. The Fabian Society set about doing just that, and the success of their mission can be seen in shocking manner in which Congress lightly surrenders its power, it does, to the executive branch in a manner which can only be described not only as reckless, but 100% unconstitutional. They're not even they speak a lot, but there is no action with these guys. There isn't. The president rules this country, folks. Now, no matter who it is. A good example would be line item vetoes powers given to the President Clinton. Yeah, I remember that. So he could actually push this certain thing out and then keep the rest of it in defiance of the Constitution. Another good example was the surrender of powers in trade negotiations, which properly belonged to the House of Representatives. As we shall see in the chapters dealing with NAFTA and GATT, this is precisely what Congress has done, thereby willingly or unwillingly, it matters not, playing right in the hands of the socialist enemies of this nation. Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw are the men who set the Fabian socialist course, penetrating and permeation rather than anarchy and violent revolution. Both were determined to ensure that the public be led to believe that socialism didn't necessarily mean left, and certainly not Marxism. Both journeyed, both journeyed to Bolshevik Russia at the height of the terror, ignoring rather than commenting on the butchery that was public knowledge. In other words, these two clowns, that's what they are, and I'm not going to play rank games with people with this. Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw took a visit to communist Russia and watched what was going on and basically cleansed it. Of the two, Webb was the most impressed with the Bolsheviks and wrote a work called Soviet Socialism, a New Civilization. It came out later after a Soviet foreign Soviet Foreign Office official defected that Webb apparently did not actually write the book, which was the work of the Soviet Foreign Office. My, oh my. Shaw and Webb became known as the demons of socialism waiting to be exercised. Before socialism could unfold its wings, and Shaw put it, rescue communism from the barricades. Although Shaw pretended not to care about form, he nevertheless expressed the belief that Fabian socialists would become a constitutional movement. Even with the greats, that is, of socialism pouring into the movement, such as Toynbee, Keyes, Hatton, Lindsay, H.G. Wells, and Huxley, Shaw and Webb kept their grip on the London Fabian Society and steered it in the direction that they have chosen so many years before. So these are major people here. There's Arnold Toynbee, Keyes. I don't know who this Halliday is. I don't know who this Lindsay is, but I do know who H.G. Wells is, and I know who Huxley is. The nearly always penniless Shaw had his degree relieved through marriage to Charlotte Payne Townsend, a lady of considerable means, which was, as some would have it, is the reason why the irascible Shaw married her. This is borne out by the fact that before the marriage vows were exchanged, Shaw insisted that he be taken care of in the form of a large prenuptial settlement. Wow, holy crap. Shaw was no longer given to a soapbox oration nor a basement meeting, but aspired to mix socially with socialism upper crust. Men like Lord Grey or Lord Asquith became his good friends, and while Shaw still took one or two trips to Moscow, he cooled towards communism, although as an avowed atheist, this did not stop Shaw from cultivating those whom he felt would be used to further his career, such as Lord Asquith in particular. That is, Shaw did not take orders from anybody, let alone the newcomers, like Hugh Gaitskell, future Prime Minister of England and a protege of the Rockefeller family. Shaw definitely considered himself as an old guard along with Sidney and Beatrice Webb. These tough, hardened professional socialists weathered many a storm over policy and never flinched in the face of other considerable outside opposition and family feuds. In fact, I read part of this book here. I'm sharing with you here, Fabians. That's what happens. There is enormous conflict, and yet these guys, it's a slow march. They just keep moving on. Okay, they don't allow that to distract them and get them off the tangent. Fabian socialism began life in 1883 as a debate society called New Life, with meeting in a small room at 17 Onsberg Street in London. It was not unlike the start of the German Nationalist Socialist movement with Hitler later took over. One of the aims of the New Life group was to bring together in an annual ground the teachings of Hegel and St. Thomas Aquinas. Interesting match there, isn't it? But the word socialism was not new, having been around since 1835, long before New Life began its infant steps in 1883, the very evening that Marx went to his death. The leader of the group, numbering 4 people, was Edward Pease, P-E-A-S-E, and their aim was to use education as the vehicle for socialistic propaganda. which was to have such a profound effect on education and politics on both sides of the Atlantic. This would seem to have been a tall order for a group of men who did not have the required public school education and necessity for would-be leaders in Victorian England. And yet, the examination of the Fabian Society shows that exactly what they accomplished. In rather grandiose style, young men named their group after Quintus, Quintas Fabian, a Roman general of note whose tactics were said to be based upon waiting patiently for the enemy to make a mistake and then striking hard. The Irishman George Bernard Shaw joined the Fabian Society in May of 1884. So this is later on. So this is 1883. So basically a year later, Shaw obtained from the Hampstead Historical Club a Marxist reading circle. It is odd how both Shaw and Marx came to socialism within a short distance of each other. Hampstead Heath is not that far from Highgate, and both frequent the British Museum. I happen to know this area well, having lived in the area of Hampstead and Highgate and spent many years of studying the British Museum. So in a sense, my perception of what Fabian socialism was about may have been clearer because of these circumstances. Never admitting to knowing Marx, although he courted his daughter, Eleanor, Shaw is suspected of having been Marx's front runner to bring socialism home to audience that is of he. Shaw addressed more often than not, 4 times a week, anywhere he could find them. A study that I made in the British Museum leads me to believe that communism invented socialism as a vehicle for its radical ideas that would not otherwise have gone down well in England or the United States, the two countries most prized for conquest by communism. There's little doubt in my mind that Shaw was Marx in disguise and socialism was communist in disguise. My theory gains added weight when we learned that Shaw attended the Socialist International in London 1864 as a Fabian delegate. As we know, Marx was the creator of the Socialist Internationals, as which his flawed theories were preached ad infinitum alongside outright communist propaganda. Karl Marx never tried to hide the unholy alliance between Communist International and his own Socialist International, but Shaw and the Webbs and later Harry Lasky vehemently denied any connection with Marxism or communism. Wow, very slick, very slick. Endless hours were spent by the Fabians splitting hairs whether it was social democracy or democratic socialism, which was to be the battle cry. In the end, it was democratic socialism that was to be used in the United States with such stunning success. Shaw's idea that socialist intellectuals, in which category he included himself, would lead to change at election time, while labor would provide the money. This was successfully co-opted by the ADA, who flooded congressional committees with experts shuttled to and from Harvard to confound and confuse senators and representatives, unschooled and inexperienced in the ways of socialism, treachery, and treason. Socialism is not about equality and freedom, folks. Never has been. Nor is it about helping the middle class and working people. No, not at all. On the contrary, it's about enslaving of the people by gradual, subtle means, a fact that Shaw once admitted to an unguarded moment. Graham Waskey's book, Great Society, and Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society were the same thing on the surface. Looked as if the people would be the beneficiaries of government largeness, but in truth, it was merely an enslavement trap, baited with socialist honey. That's the way it is. They put the rope around your neck. You take money from the government. That's how it begins, folks. It's just that simple. That's what they want you to do. As long as socialism is alive, communists cannot be dead. That is where socialism is leading this nation, into the steel trap of communism. We need to remind ourselves what the great President Andrew Jackson said about the hidden enemy in our midst. Sooner or later, your enemy will show himself, and you will know what to do. You will be confronted by many unseen enemies of your hard-fought liberty, but they will show themselves in time enough to destroy them. Let us hope that the American people, blinded by false socialistic policy of 4 presidents, will have the scales removed from their eyes before it is too late. A second Marxist is disguised with Sidney Webb, as disdainfully dismissed by Sir Bertrand Russ in later years as a clerk in the colonial office. Webb was angry in his denials that he had ever met Marx, but as it was with Shaw, there is a circumstantial evidence that Webb did indeed meet with Marx quite regularly. Unlike Shaw, who married late, Webb married Patrice Potter quite early on, a wealthy, formidable woman who was to advance his career more than he ever cared to admit. Wow. So that's why she's important here. Notice her name. Beatrice was the daughter of a Canadian railroad magnate who had fallen in love with Joseph Chamberlain, but rejected by him due to class difference. In those days, having money didn't mean automatic admission to the best circles. One had to come from the right background, which usually meant a public school education. A public school, that is in England, is the same as a private school in America. From their very first meeting, Shaw and the Webbs were on the same wavelength and became excellent team acts. The socialist revolution proposed by the Fabian Society was to cast a long, dark shadow across England and later the United States. It aims different little from those set out by the Communist Manifesto of 1848. It therefore aims at the reorganization of society by the emancipation of land and industrial capital from individuals and class ownership, investing them in the community for greater benefit, and accordingly work for the extension of private property and land. It seeks to achieve these ends by general dissemination of knowledge as to the relative relations between the individual and society in its economy, ethical, and political aspects. There was no denouncement of religion, no long-haired anarchists running around with bombs, nothing like that. Fascists were also welcome. Witness the fact that Sir Oswald Mosley and his wife, being Cynthia Curzon, I guess it's Curzon, were both firmly commended socialists before they were called to fascism. Shaw, the old guard socialist, had a high praise of Hitler in the years leading up to World War II. Instead of showing its true colors, Fabians put on a genteel air and grace that belied its dangerous revolutionary intent. The unwritten Constitution of England and the written Constitution of the United States were to be subverted and replaced by a system of state-run socialism through a process that was known as gradualism and penetration and permeation. There are some similarities here between Hitler and the Fabians. In the beginning, nobody took the slightest notice of them. But unlike Hitler, for Shaw and Webb, the vision was one where the world would evolve into a new world order in which everyone would be happy and contented, this having been brought about without resort to violence or anarchy. So it's all stealth. That's what they're doing. They're doing it in stealth way. They're not coming out and showing that the enemy. Do it in stealth. The Fabians began to spread their wings, and by 1891 were ready to publish their first Fabian News. It was during this period that Beatrice Webb began teaching radical feminism and developed the Fabian Research Program, later used with great success by Justice Louis Brandeis, and known as the Brandeis Brief. This consisted of volume after volume of research material enough to swamp opponents, covered with the thinnest of legal briefs. Not much encouragement was given to the nondescript, unimportant new members. Webb and Shaw felt their movement was one for the elite. They were not interested in mass movements of people without money and influence. For this reason, they turned their attention to Oxford and Cambridge universities, where the sons of the elite were educated and who were later to take the Fabian message, suitably disguised as reforms, into the heart and soul of the Parliament. The Fabian Society goals was to get socialists installed in positions of power where their influence could be counted on to bring about reforms. This program, somewhat modified, was practiced in the United States also and produced by Roosevelt, Kennedy, Johnson, and Clinton. Socialists all. Some agents of change were trained in the Fabian way of combining sociology with politics to open doors. Mere members were never its style. One of their elite, Arthur Henderson, who was a British foreign minister in 1929, was the guiding, leading light in getting diplomatic recognition for the monstrous Bolshevik regime, with the United States following suit a few years later. That's correct, folks. You see? Amazing, isn't it? 12 years later, now they are actually having diplomatic recognition with the Soviet Union. And only a few years later, under the guiding arms of Roosevelt, they're seen the same way. And yet, most people are unaware that the industrialists and the bankers are the ones who actually set up and developed what we call the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It's also the ones that set up Nazism with Adolf Hitler. They funded both sides, folks. The first Fabian Society cell in Oxford opened in 1895, and by 1920 there were 3 more, with students forming more than 20% of the membership. This was perhaps the most profound period for the Fabian Society's growth. Students being inducted into socialism, many of whom went on to become world leaders. A little movement that nobody paid any attention to in 1891 had arrived. One of the most dangerous, radical revolutionary movements of the 20th century had taken root in England and was already starting its spread to the United States. Lasky, Galbraith, Attlee, Beaverbrook, Sir Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wallace, Chase, and Wallace, there were some of the Fabian socialists who were to have a profound effect in shaping the course the United States was to take. This was particularly true of Professor Lasky. Few in the government of this 30 years that Lasky spent in America ever became aware of the depth of his penetration into education and the very government itself. This was a man who put the tentacles of socialism into the daily practice. Lasky lectured in many of the states and in the universities of Oregon, California, Colorado, Columbia University, Yale, Harvard, and Roosevelt University in Chicago, which is actually Chicago University. No, yeah. Well, maybe I'm wrong. I'm sorry. It is Roosevelt. I've never heard of it. Okay, sorry about that. During all this time, he constantly urged the adoption of the federal program of social insurance, which he admitted to say will lead to the socialist goal of a total welfare state. Look around you, folks. How many people are on the welfare these days? Look around you. They're dependent, you see. In later years, Lasky, Wallace, Keyes, and many other Fabian Society political leaders and economists would go to Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, it's all connected, to learn the methods of John Rawlins Rees, which became known as the interconditioning and long-range penetration. It was to this school that Henry Kissinger was also sent. Gradually, as with their custom, Fabians began to penetrate both the Labor and Liberal parties from where they exerted great influence in the socializing of the Englishmen. Formerly sturdily independent and not known to accept government aid. That's the key, folks. When you get that government aid, it's like a ring, it's like a rope around your neck. Because then you're dependent upon them. And you'll do whatever it is they want. While the Webbs claimed credit for the penetration techniques, the claim was rudely upset in 1952 by Colonel I.M. Bogolopov, I spelled it for you, Bogolepov, who said that the entire plan was written for the Webbs in the Social Foreign Office, as much of the material in the many books that Webb claimed to have written was not. Bogolopov, I'm sorry, it's just Bogolepov, went on to say that much of the material in Webb's books he had personally written. They changed it just a bit here and there, otherwise it was a copy verbatim, the colonel said. It is so often the case when leftists or socialist heroes are debunked, the press covers up and praises the exposed ones with masses of irrelevant verbiage until the charge is all but forgotten. We see this almost daily in the press with regard to moral character and political ineptitude of President Clinton. He is theirs, and no matter what he said of him, they will not let the mud stick. An intelligent colleague of mine said, and watch Clinton they do. Analyzing reports of Clinton questionable morality and political mistakes, one cannot help but be impressed by the Fabian socialist damage control. Wash the target and smooth the attacker in verbiage that has little relevance to the issue. In studying the history of the Fabian Society in the British Museum in London, I was struck by the awesome progress of the tiny band of unknowns who went on to bring some of the most important politicians, writers, teachers, economists, scientists, philosophers, religious leaders, and publishers in the Fabian Society orbit, while the world seemed never to notice its existence, while the profound changes that were coming into being were not cause for alarm can be explained. Every single move made by the Fabians was cloaked in the mantle of reforms, and the Fabian techniques of equating reforms with beneficial, just, or good was the key to their success. Wrap it up in a nice package. Same things held good for American socialists. Every major move made by the socialists felt common in Washington is disguised as reforms that are going to benefit the people. The trick is as always the hills, yet voters fall for it every time. Roosevelt's New Deal was lifted straight out of the Fabian Socialist book of the same title written by Stuart Chase. Yet similarly, it was accepted as a genuine reform of the system. Even Woodrow Wilson's recognition of the treacherous Kerensky government was clothed in language crafted to intentionally deceive the American people that reforms going on in Russia were for the benefit of the common people. Johnson's Great Society was another great program, lifted straight out of the book written by Graham Wallas, W-A-L-L-A-S, called The Great Society. We can fight a war, and we can provide butter, and everything, meaning for the social programs for people. And most people who are born in this, in other words, given this type of money at first, their family never comes out of it. They're still dependent. And the next family after them in the same family. In other words, their children and their grandchildren do the same thing. Very few get out of it. With the London School of Socialist Economics established, although nowhere near as pretentious in the beginning as the title sounded, Fabian socialists began increasing influence in shaping monetary policies on both sides of the Atlantic. The facility was vastly upgraded when the Rockefeller Foundation gave it a substantial grant. The method of funding socialist institutions, that is, through grants by the wealthy elite and its day-to-day programs for the poor, is believed to be the idea of Shaw, which he activated after he attended a lecture at the London School of Economics. Basically, making the poor pay for local programs came down to startling trade unions among the working class, and then using members' dues to facilitate and fund socialist programs. It is rather like the Freemasons, who are prone to let us know that they're contributing generous amounts of money to charities, but the money usually comes from the public, folks, not from the Mason coffers. These guys are devils, are simply devils, folks. And people believe them, you see, because they put on a good show. The United States, the Shriners are famous for donating money to hospitals, but the money comes from the public, like street parades the Shriners hold. None of their own money goes to hospitals. Makes you sick, doesn't it? If you think about it, if you knew this, they don't even put out their own money. You see, they're all hypocrites. The four pillars of the House of Socialism, written by Sidney Webb shortly after World War I, became the blueprint for future socialist action, not only in Britain, but also in the United States. The plan called for destruction of a system of production of goods and services based on competition, unlimited taxation, massive state welfare, and no private property rights, and a one world government. These objectives did not differ all that much from the principles that laid down by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. The difference laid in methods of application, style, rather than in substance. In detail, state financial welfare was to be the first principle. The right of women to vote was included. That is the birth of women's rights movements. All land to be nationalized with no private property rights. And that's what's occurred here in the United States, especially out west. The government owns almost all the land out there. When I say almost, I mean It's over at least 60%. It's probably more than that. All industries serving the people, that is rail, power, light, phone, etc., to be nationalized. Private property to be eliminated from the insurance industry. Confiscation of wealth via taxation to be stepped up. And finally, the concept of a one world government was spelled out. International economic controls, international courts providing international legislation governing social affairs. A curious examination of the Communist Manifesto of 1848 reveals where the research for the four pillars was done. While four pillars dealt exclusively with socializing Britain, many of its ideas were put into practice by Wilson, Roosevelt, Johnson, Carter, and now Clinton. Labor and the new socialist order had made the big time in the United States, where its sternly revolutionary aims went unrecognized, even as Hitler was being held up as the greatest threat to the world. Whether we like it or not, the policies and the programs initiated by Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Johnson, Carter, and Reagan all bore the same stamp, made in England by the Fabian Society. This is truer with Clinton than any other of the former presidents. Ramsay MacDonald, sent to the United States to spy out the land, went on to become British first Fabian Society Socialist Prime Minister. MacDonald set the pattern for future prime ministers to surround themselves with Fabian socialist advisors. A tradition carried on by Margaret Thatcher, John Major. Across the Atlantic, Fabian socialists surrounded President Wilson and presented a program to socialize the United States. It was altogether a spectacular achievement for those few men who, under the leadership of Peace, P-E-A-S-E, hence, who set out to change the world at the turn of the century and did so by making full use of the presidential advisors. One of the rising stars in Fabian Society influence circles was Sir Stafford Cripps, C-R-I-P-P-S, a nephew of Beatrice Webb. Sir Stafford played a major role in advising American socialists on how to get the United States to join in the World War II. In 1929, Cripps had been a guiding light for the upper crust entry into Fabians, this in spite of the fact that Fabians and communists had become blur along the edges, and several leading conservatives of the day warned that they were little to choose between Fabian socialists and communists other than this lack of membership cards for the Fabian socialists. The year 1929 also saw the rise of another star who was destined to shape the economic and financial policy of other nations, including his own England, but perhaps more importantly, that of the United States. John Maynard Keyes had become a virtue Fabian Society icon thanks to men like Gonzalez, his giant Left Publishing House and Left Book Club, and Harry Joseph Lasky. Rare Fabian Society papers I saw in the British Museum were of the opinion that without the blessing of Lasky, Keyes would not have amounted to much. Lasky was once described in these papers as everybody's ideal of a socialist. Even the great H.G. Wells bowed the knee to Lasky, calling him the greatest socialist intellectual in the English-speaking world. And guess what, folks? Lasky came from a Jewish parent background. In moderate circumstances, it is said the rise of Hitler was what turned him to be a militant for Jewish rights in Palestine. Clashes with Ernest Bevin, B-E-V-I-N, Socialist Prime Minister of Britain, were frequent and furious. On May Day 1945, Lasky, as the chairman of the British Labour Party, made a speech in which he reiterated that he did not believe in the Jewish religion because he was a Marxist. But now Lasky said he believed the rebirth of the Jewish nation in Palestine was vitally necessary. This was confirmed by Ben Gurianti himself. Lasky's opinion was conveyed to President Truman and Rabbi Stephen Wise on April 20th, 1945. Truman had inherited Roosevelt's hardline stand in favor of Jewish aspirations, as dictated by Lasky. And when trouble began brewing over the question of Jewish settlers being allowed in Palestine, Truman sent a copy of what many believe was a Fabian Socialist report on the status of refugees camps in Europe, urging then Foreign Secretary Bevin, B-E-V-I-N, let 100,000 Jews immigrate from those camps and settle in Palestine. So this was already happening after the war. Truman's message caused Bevin to take deep umbrage with both Lasky and Truman. Belbish's image of Jews were neither pro nor anti. His views were decidedly tempered by those of Clement Attlee, then Prime Minister of England. As Bevan saw it, the Jews were not a nation, while on the other hand, the Arabs were. The Jews don't need a state of their own, Belvin said. He told Lasky that he would not pay the slightest attention to Truman's suggestion, putting it down to pressure from the New York Jewish vote. Belvin refused to see it, Lasky and Truman way, resulting in endless squabbling. Belvin adhered to his policy based on his belief that the Arabs were essentially indigenous to the region and pro-British, while a Zionist state meant an intrusion of an alien, disruptive element which would weaken the regime, and open the doors to communism. Even when Wiseman went to meet with him, Belvin refused to offer more than a monthly quota of 1,500 Jews who could go to Palestine. From this had to be deducted the number of illegal Jewish immigrants who entered Palestine each of the months. This is one of the very few occasions that Fabian Socialists and Lasky suffered a severe defeat. Ayn Rand is said to have used Lasky as her model for her 1943 novel, The Fountainhead. And Saul Bellow wrote, "I shall never forget Mosley's observation on Harry Lasky on packing the Supreme Court." Remember, that's under Woodrow Wilson. Under Franklin Roosevelt now. He tried to stack it. He tried to pack it. If it hadn't been for them fighting it back, he would have got his wish, but he kept fighting for it. It's another start. Most people don't even know that. On the Russian purge trials and on Hitler, Lasky's influence is still felt in the United States. 44 years after his death, his associates with Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Louis Brandeis, which was a judge, so was Felix Frankenberg, Edward R. Murrow, Max Lerner, Averell Haberman, and David Rockefeller for the profound change, the course and direction which the founding fathers have set this nation. Continue. Lasky taught as professor at political science at the London School of Economics and was chairman of the British Labour Party when Aneurin Bevan was prime minister, Bevan. Lasky was like George Bernard Shaw. He would not hesitate to walk up and introduce himself to anyone he wanted to meet. He cultivated friendship with the most important people in the furtherance of socialist causes. His personality was described by close associate Richard Crossman as warm and gregarious, a man who made it to the top on his own, a public intellectual. It's said of Lasky that he was generous and kind and that people liked to be with him. All the while, the indefatigable socialist crusader. A notable milestone of progress for Fabian socialists came in the 1940s when Belver's report on a series of essays simply entitled Social Security. The year 1942 was chosen precisely for psychological reasons. Britain was facing its darkest days of World War II. Now was the time for socialists to offer hope. Lasky offered the scheme to John G. Winant, W-I-N-A-N-T, United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James. Mrs. Eugene Myers of the Washington Post described the intention of Roosevelt. In Britain, Fabian Socialist Society, notable like Lord Pakenham, Pakenham, made hundreds of high-profile speeches in favor of the miracle of abolishing want and deprivation. The British public was ecstatic. Nothing like giving money away. But where does it come from? It never comes from their pocketbook, folks. Never does. They always talk this stuff. And that's very critical for you to understand. They take it from the haves. They are indeed devils. They're nothing but hypocrites. They steal from everybody. But 5 years later, found the British government borrowing heavily from the United States to make Social Security work. John Strasser, so idolized by the Fabian socialists, discovered that no matter how much he regulated the amount of Social Security, increasing it when needed, it was still not enough to generate purchasing power. So Trotsky, number one Marxist and Minister of Food Supply, had to ration supplies. The socialists almost bankrupt the country in 1 year in 1947. spending $2.75 billion on their socialist program, the money borrowed from the United States. The loans were the work of Lasky and Harry Dexter White of the United States Treasury and a Soviet informer. It's truly amazing that the American people stood silent in the face of the kind of financing of socialist pipe dreams that they were expected to carry. The only reason which comes to mind as to why the American people did not protest is quite simply that the truth was hidden from them. The Federal Reserve lent Britain $3 billion in 1920 so that the dole, the welfare system, could continue. While at home, war veterans' pensions were cut by $4 billion a year as a partial contribution. Could such a thing ever happen again? The informed opinion is that not only can it happen again, but that the reaction from the American people would be the same, for the most part, one of total indifference. But even with the unstinging, albeit unofficial help of Harry Dexter White, socialism could not on its own fund its grandiose schemes, and when the Congress finally discovered the full extent of White's financial help for socialist Britain, Sir Sanford Cripps had to come right out with it and tell the British people that henceforth Social Security would have to be funded through taxing their incomes. In the period of 47 through 49, taxes mounted. Food became scarce, incomes dwindled, and although one Fabian brain trust after another worked tirelessly to come up with a solution that would make socialism work, other than borrowing money from the United States, they always came back to the same thing: deficit spending or scrap the Fabian socialist programs as unworkable. But yet, these people, these rich people, who these people are, never give their money to any of this, folks. Never do. You're expected to carry the load. They're hypocrites, indeed, true hypocrites. Britain was reduced from a profitable tender of goods and services and broker's agent for other nations to a beggar nation. In short, socialism programs were responsible for the destruction of its centuries-old thriving economy. Britain began to resemble a banana republic, grabbing at straws. The Labour Party, its leadership, that is, Fabian socialists almost to a man, thought it could make things work by more nationalization and more rationing, but the electorate did not give the Fabian Society a chance, turning Labour out of office in general elections in 1950. The Fabian Society legacy, an empty treasure, gold reserves gone, production down to an all-time low, it sought to distance itself from the discredited Labour Party on the grounds that the Fabian Society is not a political party. Speaking in the House of Commons, a notable socialist, Albert Edwards, said, "I have spent years discouraging on the defects of this capitalist system. I do not withdraw these criticisms, but we have seen the two systems side by side, and the man who would still argue for socialism as the means of ridding our country of the defects of capitalism is blind indeed. Socialism just does not work. Of course it doesn't. Never has. Never will. It's this way of robbing people and feeling sorry for people, you know? When people, when you have a functioning, completely capitalist society, if it's working correctly, then people will have jobs. And the same thing's happening here. But anyway, yet in spite of the total and abject failure of socialism in practice as opposed to theory, there were still those in the United States who were determined to thrust the failed socialist policies down the throats of the American people, such as Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Bush. Carter seemed determined to ignore the great socialist debacle on the other side of the Atlantic and, urged on by their socialist advisors, plunge ahead with American versions of the same old failed Fabian socialist theories and policies. Still tied to Britain through a common language and a common heritage, the socialists were able to enmesh the United States in their dream of a one world government through the so-called Atlantic Alliance or Atlantic Union. Ignoring the wisdom of President George Washington's farewell address, successive Americans went ahead with what was essentially a Fabian socialist scheme for a world government in which America for democratic action played no small part. Also, much to the fore in this strictly socialist enterprise was the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the RUA, headquartered at Chatham House, St. James Square, London, the mother of the American Council of Foreign Relations. The socialist hand also across the sea drive was hosted by the president of Owen Lattimore at Leeds University. Lattimore, a Johns Hopkins professor, is best remembered for his treasonous conduct while in charge of the Institute for Pacific Relations, which is blamed for the instigation of the United States trade policies towards Japan that spurred the attack on Pearl Harbor and got the United States into World War II, a time when the German army had thoroughly trounced the so-called Allies who were staring defeat in the face of Europe. I think I might stop here because it's probably a little over an hour. It's actually an hour and 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. This is a fascinating read here. I've only gone through about 18 pages of this book. This is amazing. This is amazing information here. You know, just this is unbelievable. I mean, actually gone 21 pages. It's a lot of information, a lot of good stuff in this stuff too. If people would see where they're at, it's time to bring the veil down, folks. Time to see life as it is. We're going to conclude with this. Again, this is a fantastic piece of work by Dr. John Coleman, who was trying to warn people. And you see it everywhere around you, folks. A lot of people live in denial, think things are going to work out fine. I'm just going to do my own thing here. I'm just going to believe in some magic's going to happen. But all around you, folks, the collapse is happening all around us, everywhere, throughout the world. You got ears to hear, you'll hear it. If you have eyes to see, you will see. You choose. All right, we'll talk to you another time. Thank you for being here. And we'll conclude, we'll deal actually with this another time. That is another chapter of this book. Actually, I haven't gone through the first chapter. Brilliant work. Thank you, John Coleman, for doing this. Thank you for the sacrifice you did. All right. Wish you good night. Take care.